My name is Joe Sayers, and the talk today is on critical thinking in a digital world, which was actually set up quite nicely earlier on in the plenary session by Adam November. If you would like to do any social media or contact me, these are contact details. Also, if you would like to look at the slides as we go through on your own device, you're welcome. This is the URL. That will be shared again at the end. But if you'd like, as we go through, you're welcome to look as well. So just a quick, sorry, I want to take a photo. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we are going to be looking at today. So the first thing is what is critical thinking? Because it's a term that's sort of used quite a lot, maybe in connection with sort of 21st century skills, and you see it talked about, but we're going to sort of look at what a definition might be, and why do we need it in this digital age? Again, something that was mentioned earlier on. The second thing is some considerations to some things to consider when trying to improve critical thinking skills in our learners. I guess just to sort of, as a forewarning, it's not really something which there's a clean-cut answer of there's a right thing to do or a wrong thing to do. So we're just going to look at some considerations, and then hopefully you can kind of apply them to your context. And then thirdly, we're going to do a practical activity of designing a task around some critical thinking competencies that we can kind of do together and share with each other. So that's the focus. And also just to say, context is a key thing here. So I'm talking about this and critical thinking from my context, which is I'm from the UK and I live in London. And a lot of the examples I've used are from UK media or things that I've heard about. I'm not necessarily suggesting that transfers exactly to your context. I hope that you guys can then take what's applicable to your context and adapt it in a way that suits you guys. So I'm not suggesting that what I'm saying is exactly relevant to you guys, but hopefully some of it will cross over. But first, just to sort of talk about why we're all here and why I'm here. So ELTjam is an organisation. Can I have a hands up how many of you read or know the ELTjam blog or ELTjam as an organisation? Okay, so a few of you. So ELTjam, we started life as a blog about 5 years ago now, talking about technology in English language teaching. So our background is in English language teaching. What I'm talking about today isn't specific to English language teaching, it's relevant to any sort of field of education, but that's where our background is. And the work that we do is kind of bridging this gap between the sort of traditional education side of the industry, which is teaching, pedagogy, publishing, English language teaching, sort of market understanding and so on, with then sort of new ways of working, a sort of focus on design and user experience and technology. So we help organisations by kind of bridging that gap, so working with publishers and traditional education organisations to help them do this bit better, and then working with kind of startups and new organisations to help them do that bit better. That's how we sort of position ourselves. Some of the slides we're seeing, hopefully you guys can still see. So yeah, these are some of the organisations that we work with, doing training, product management, consultancy, etc. And so we work around using digital, and we see that increasingly there are sort of skills that are needed that maybe weren't talked about before or weren't discussed before. So that's kind of what my background is in technology for learning, and then actually the sort of new skills that are maybe needed as a result of this technology, which is hence the topic of the talk today. This is also, we do some online teacher training and development courses, and that's our academy website there. And a big thank you to the British Council as well, who have brought me out here today to do this talk. Came out for another conference a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, hoping to sort of do more work in this region. So thank you to the British Council for organising this. Okay, so that's a little bit about me and why I'm here, but it would be nice to hear from you guys and why you're here. So I've got a couple of questions for you to answer in small groups, just to, because through the course of the session we're going to have to be talking with each other and doing a task together at the end. So it'd be nice if we got to know each other a little bit. Okay, so it's a classroom management technique where if you want the class to stop talking, you put your hand up in the air, and if you see me with my hand up in the air, you put your hand up in the air as well, and give me a wave, and stop talking, and then everybody's stopped talking. It's perfect. So if that happens, if you see me with my hand in the air, that's why. So the questions, I'm going to just read out the questions. Oh, they're back. Well, at least we've introduced the classroom management technique. Okay. So I shall leave you now. I'll give you 2 minutes with your neighbours to answer some of these questions. Okay. Okay, so just a couple of bits of information back. Why did you decide to attend this talk today? Anybody want to volunteer an answer for that?
Because we need to look for a new strategies in the classroom, a new way of see things.
Okay. Yeah, new strategies, new ways of seeing things. What about this question? If your career were a movie, who would be the hero and who would be the villain? Any heroes?
Rain Man.
Who?
Rain Man.
Rain Man. And any villains? Sorry? Different perspectives. Yesterday I gave a session and I asked the same question and someone said my students would be the heroes and technology would be the villain. And someone else actually said I would be the hero. She was saying she would be the hero. And when do you feel most proud of what you do?
Doing my master in education.
Oh, nice.
When it helps someone in their lives.
Sorry?
When it helps someone change their lives. So for example, if one of my IELTS students gets into the band score that they want, it's when I feel.
Yeah, nice. So just saying when you help your student to achieve something they want to achieve. Okay, we're going to do a quick activity now. Although it's going to be difficult for you guys, because what I would like you to do is everybody to stand up, please. Actually, no, sorry, you can stay seated. It's okay. We'll do it differently because of this. Sorry. So you guys are exempt from this game. So we're going to just to try and get your understanding of where you what your beliefs are around technology within education. So there's a phrase here, a statement here. Technology is changing how we teach. So have a think about where you sit on this class. So if you believe number one, so for those of you who can't read, it says technology is changing how we teach. Strongly disagree 1 up to strongly agree 5. Is anybody here a 1? Anybody a 2? Anybody a 3? A couple of 3s. Anybody a 4? And who's a 5? Okay, so it seems that maybe like a 4 or 5, mostly at this end. And then what about this? Technology is changing what we teach. Yes. Technology is changing what we teach. So again, same client, same rating scale. Anybody a number 1? Yeah, you're a number 1. So a couple of 1s. Anybody 2? 3? 4? And any 5s? Okay. So maybe more strongly agreeing with the previous one. It's changing how we teach maybe more than what we teach. But kind of interesting just to consider that, what impact it's having on the way that we're doing things, but also the subject matter that we're teaching or that we're helping our students to learn. Okay, so something to bear in mind, I guess, as we go through the session today. So the first sort of section is what is critical thinking and why do we need it in this digital age? So from this morning, I don't know, were all of you in the plenary session from Alan's talk this morning? He actually said if we don't teach critical thinking skills, we'll look back on Trump as the good old days. Which is quite a scary prospect, and I thought it was quite a nice way of setting up this session because, well, I mean, if that's what we've got at stake, then it kind of makes this seem like a worthwhile thing to be focusing on. I'll just give you a second to read this as well. So this is from a set of competency standards that were written around critical thinking competencies, which we're going to look at a little bit throughout the session actually, but I thought that this was quite an interesting sort of section from their opening introduction. A lot of the information that our learners see, especially now through digital media, has already got some kind of an agenda. There's already some sort of, it's maybe packaged or represented to serve somebody's interest rather than purely to give information to people. So the more, and actually, and this is quite interesting as well, that it's maybe at odds with the individual benefit for the learner or for the reader, and maybe at odds with the public good as well. So I think it kind of sets up that it's an important thing to focus on. So there's that, yeah, and I kind of contributed to by this changing landscape. So there's much more complexity and interdependence as a result of technology. So we're much more connected to each other, much more access to information. And this kind of interdependence between everybody is kind of increasing and changing the way that our learners, the sort of information and skills that our learners need as they grow up. At least in the UK, there's a lot of articles around artificial intelligence and how it's going to kind of remove a large section of the job market. It's quite interesting to see actually about, well, if you search for articles that came from the last year, lots of the terminology is around artificial intelligence could take our jobs, might take our jobs, how many of our jobs will it take? And if you just change that search in the last month, you can see there's already a change in the language to will take our jobs. And here, like robots will take our jobs, we just need to plan for it, kind of thing. So this is something which our learners are being bombarded with, and also the sort of job market that they're going to grow up into is potentially going to be quite different from how it is now. And sort of just to highlight, this is from the World Economic Forum, talking about the sorts of skills that our learners are going to need, or that young people are going to need, or in fact, actually just talks about the skills that are most important now. And you can see that critical thinking and sort of complex problem solving are really high up on that list. And I guess they've always been important. I think it's probably an overstatement to say that this is something which is only emerging now, but I think that the situation that we're in, especially regarding the technology that's around and the sheer volume of information that's around, makes these kind of things even more important. And also along with that, there's huge challenges that the world is facing and needs to solve. And again, I'm sure, I mean, the world has always had challenges that need solving, but now the sort of interconnectedness of us as individuals and of countries means that these problems are things that, you know, need all of us to work together towards. So I just sort of listed a couple here. I mean, I'm sure there's more, and this is not in any particular order, but just to kind of highlight that there's some real big challenges that we're facing as a planet. And also I thought it was really interesting that the students themselves at the beginning of the plenary today were asking for our help specifically with this problem. So they were saying, the student mentioned how the White House study, which I actually didn't know about before, where if you were to Google two different people Googling the same thing, got information back to them that sort of supported their own views. And the students themselves saying, we need your help and guidance as teachers. I thought it was really nice that, you know, it's not just us saying, okay, students need these new skills, but actually students saying, actually, please can we have your support in developing these, and we're looking to you now to help us with this. Okay, so that's kind of maybe why we need it, but actually what is critical thinking and how do we define it? So I started then I guess the most obvious place to start for a definition, I looked at Wikipedia, and this is what they say. Yeah, it must be right, yes. Okay, so yeah, fairly sort of standard definition there. And then critical thinking, at least in the UK, is something which I kind of associated with universities. This is the place where maybe it's, for me at least, I think it was first sort of explicitly focused on. So I looked at a couple of university websites, and then you get sort of information a bit more like this. It's kind of being active in the way that we process information. Processing with skepticism and doubt rather than just not really questioning it. I'm going to play a video now. This is a student from the same university just talking about what she understands critical thinking to mean. Oh, actually, I don't think I've got audio.
Critical thinking is quite important when you're at university. It means instead of just taking an article and reading it and then maybe referencing it and saying, well, this person said this or this.
Can you hear that right now? I think we're not going to be able to do that because the audio isn't connected. But I'll just paraphrase. So she was saying that it's about not just reading something and unquestioningly believing it. It's about trying to find out what the bias might be, or trying to assess what the bias might be in somebody's argument, or where they got their information from. And even if they're quoting certain sources, what sources aren't they quoting, or what have they left out of their information? And then allowing you to use that to then inform your own opinions. So I think that's kind of quite an interesting thing, really. Not just, well, that's kind of the way that I see some of the kind of important aspect of it, is not just believing the things that you're told. Okay, so that's maybe like a couple of definitions and a bit more of an idea of what it is, but what in practical terms does this look like? What are the sort of competencies that make this up? So I've written two here, so distinguish between legitimate and dubious online sources. So you're going to be getting a lot of information, what's real, what's more trustworthy, and what's less trustworthy. Understanding if there's an ulterior motive behind the information that we encounter. So what is the agenda? Is there an agenda behind what we're encountering? So that's just two. What I'd like you to do now with your partner, the person near you, is see if you can write 5 more competencies, 5 more examples of a competency around critical thinking. I'll give you just 2 minutes with a group of 2 or 3 of you. Okay, let's stop there. Nice to see your hands. Can we have anybody volunteering number 3? So them providing their own opinion. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's about providing an opinion, but then maybe also justifying that opinion. Yeah. Yeah, that's something we're going to look at a bit later as well, actually. How do you, is it context specific, or how can you actually relate that to different contexts? Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important aspect. Identifying assumptions. Yeah, taking decisions, making judgments about the information that we receive. Okay, so what I'm going to share with you now is the document I mentioned earlier, which was around competencies for critical thinking that's been written by a critical thinking organisation. It's a long document, and lots of it won't be relevant really right now. It's something to probably digest over a little bit more time. But if you go to page 18 of that document, it starts listing competencies in different areas. So what I'd like you to do is just kind of with, maybe on your own, or if you've got, with a partner if you've only got one device, read through and see the sorts of competencies that they've defined. Just as a warning, this is quite an in-depth list, so I'm not suggesting that you kind of try and tackle all of these things, but it's just maybe a useful resource. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to compare what you wrote to the things in this document. And this is the URL here. Okay, so as I said, probably more information than you can take in right now, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the kind of things that make up critical thinking. They've organized them into different categories. This is just a couple that I pulled out just as a way of example. You in? Should we find it?
So, yes, sorry?
No. Yes, starting from page 18 and you scroll down. That's 56, so I think from page 18. So yeah, these are just a couple that I've pulled out. So explaining in their own words the purpose of reasoning through problems. So this is quite interesting. It's actually requiring them to be able to explain why critical thinking is an important thing as well. And this one as well, demonstrating recognition that the mind naturally seeks to hide unjustifiable assumptions in the mind in order to maintain its belief system. So this is getting to quite a deep level of understanding here, understanding that you yourself will naturally try to hide things that don't make sense to your existing view so that you can continue to pursue the things that are that you're used to pursuing. So I think, you know, some of these things might be relevant for your learners, some of them might not be, but I think good or helpful to get an understanding of the full range of competencies that there are, and then you can just pick and choose the ones that you feel most comfortable teaching or that would be most beneficial to your learners. So yeah, maybe some bedtime reading for you all there. Okay, so if this is a super important thing, and we've established that, you know, this is maybe a time that these skills really need to be developed in young people, and we now get a bit of an understanding of what these sorts of things are, let's look at how young people are actually doing. There was a study that was done by the Stanford History Group around the ability for young people to evaluate different bits of information that they see through digital resources. And this was how they described the work they did. So specifically around young people's ability to understand information that floods their smartphones, tablets, and computers. This idea of a huge amount of information coming in, how able are they to actually analyze this information effectively? So obviously they say when a study is done like this with a range of different age groups and lots of different people in different areas, there's a huge amount of variety in the sorts of data that comes back. There's loads of different variables. But they said that one thing that was consistent amongst all of the data was that young people showed an inability to critically process the information that they're receiving digitally. And in the slides there's a link to the document, so you can read it in a little bit more detail. But they carried out 3 studies with 3 different age groups, and I'm going to just quickly show you the studies because I think it's quite kind of illuminating to see what was shown. So the first one was a homepage analysis, and their thinking was, increasingly, organizations try and hide advertising as native or authentic content. So they showed young people a homepage with a mix of different types of advert on. So some kind of more obvious adverts that have a 20% off sign or something. But then also one advert that had this sponsored content title at the top of it. And what they said was lots of people were able to spot the kind of traditional standard advert, but very few of the people that they studied, I can't actually remember, I think it's something like 25% only, identified that this here was an advert, despite it saying on it sponsored content. So people not really even necessarily, or young people not necessarily even realizing or understanding the kind of obvious, or what you might think of as obvious markers for content with a specific agenda versus content which is purely there to inform or to entertain. The second thing they did was around evaluating evidence and how likely young people are to actually evaluate what seems to be on face value some evidence for them. And what they did was they showed this picture. And the picture is, for those of you who can't see it clearly, it's a sort of like photoshopped image of daisies that look like they've got two heads. And the premise was that this is the flowers which are now growing near Fukushima after the spill, after the nuclear reactor damage. And what was quite interesting is that the learners didn't then follow through to think, okay, well, what other things have happened there, or how can I research this, or find out whether this is actually true. And people just kind of accepting on face value the things that they show, saying, oh wow, what an amazing thing that's happening there, rather than actually questioning it. The third one was around claims on social media. And this was how likely young people are to think about what the sources of a particular tweet or bit of information that they see online are. So they showed this article which was, USA-centric, around a poll showing that the National Rifle Association is out of touch with its members, and that actually the members of the National Rifle Association would prefer more strict controls. But what only a very small majority of the people then, the young people that were surveyed then did, is actually go and find out information about the organizations that had presented them with that information and what the hidden agenda or underlying interest might be. So MoveOn.org and CAP, I can't remember actually what CAP stands for, but they're both organizations that lobby the government for stricter gun control. So you may be in favor of stricter gun control, but still you should be able to understand or be aware that actually this might not be, this study may be biased in some way because it is set up by and promoted by organizations that have got an interest in a certain way. But I think it was only about 20% of the people that were surveyed looked further and looked into the sources of that tweet. And this is what Alan November was saying this morning as well. People just very seldom even look beyond the first page of Google. And you have a look for something, it confirms what you might have already been looking for or expected, and then leave it at that and move on. So that's a kind of summary just of their study. But it'd be interesting, and this was in America, and young people in America, and like only those three sort of specific exercises. But it would be good now for you guys, or for me, to know a little bit more about what you think young people in your context, or how they would fare with these sorts of questions. So I'm going to just, again, with your group, if you could just kind of try and answer a couple of these things. So how well would your students do in these tests? And then other sort of relating this idea of critical thinking and the need for critical thinking into your context. So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to discuss with your groups again. Great. Works well. Does anybody think that their students would be actually quite good at these? Yeah.
Actually, it depends on the topic itself. I mean, some topics the students would feel they're engaged in this, for example, topic, or they have information, so they feel that there is conflict between their information and what they see, then they'll start the research about this topic. Maybe if they have no clue about it, they won't bother themselves.
Okay, that's quite an interesting insight. So the more knowledge that they have, the more likely they are to then go and fact check things because it might not match with what they've currently. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Any other comments on this, or any other thoughts on how your learners might fare in this? Yeah.
I've spent quite a bit of time in this part of the world, 3 years in Egypt and 2.5 years in Jordan, and what I find is that one of the biggest challenges students have is the ability to question and criticize everything. I think there's a lot of learner training involved in terms of, number one, forming their own ideas and their own opinions, and number two, actively questioning and actively criticizing everything.
Yeah.
I think because of like a traditional educational background to an extent, people are not brought up questioning.
Yeah, I don't know about the education system here, but at least, in places where I think things are, information is presented, then and there's not a sort of critical element to to the way that information is presented in the first place, then maybe this is like a more important element to it as well. I think I might move past that question. Any other thoughts on how technology specifically is impacting critical thinking in this context? Any thoughts on that? Is it a similar kind of thing, or are there any other considerations, or any other challenges or potential issues? Yeah.
She was saying.
Okay.
And sometimes you think, like students, for example, in math, if they want to solve a question, they don't. The second question about damage to the society, they don't use the basic knowledge anymore, the basic skills that we were taught when we were little. It's just grab a calculator on your phone and you do your calculation. They've lost the basic multiplication table, for example.
So that's quite an interesting point. So maybe
So
technology...
that's damaging to our society, because if it's not available, how can they use this, how can they calculate this?
So maybe the advancement of technology initially stopped a lot of the need for that extra sort of processing, and then that's having an impact now in terms of reducing ability to think critically around other things as well. Yeah, that's quite an interesting point. Yeah, one more thing.
I just wanted to reflect on what she said. I think it's about balance. This is what Mr. November was talking about in the opening session. We lost that, but we're gaining something else. If I can do this in the calculator and get a very quick response, then I might be giving the student time to think about higher thinking, critical thinking skills.
But if that isn't done...
It's all about a balance.
Yeah.
But if it isn't done, like he said, then...
Yeah. So it needs to
The
go...
question says, what damage is this caused to our society?
If you look at it as damage, I don't see it as damage.
I mean, look at
You guys can continue the conversation at break time. Okay. Around how technology is impacting critical thinking in your context, do you have something you wanted to say? Right. Okay. Did anybody have any points on? I think that was what was just said then. That the technology is initially stopped people from having to do some additional processing, which then is now meaning that maybe that extra sort of critical step isn't being taken with other information.
I know recently the buzzword fake news.
Yes.
A lot of the younger generations have got to grips with that, so they're actually questioning the validity of everything they see now.
Yeah, that's true actually. Fake news may be helpful in sort of like popularizing the idea that actually some stuff is fake, and maybe it'll come back on Trump in the end in terms of people questioning the things that he's putting out there as well. I'm going to move on because we've got a fair amount to get through still, but maybe you guys can carry on your conversations in the break time. So now some things to consider. So I guess hopefully that's kind of set it up as an important thing in terms of how technology is impacting this, how important it is, some of the sort of competencies that we might want to develop in our learners, and then maybe some of the gaps between the kind of ideal state and then where our learners might be now. So we're going to look at some considerations, and as I said at the beginning, unfortunately I can't really give, and I'm sure there are people who could, but I'm not able to give really firm answers on this is exactly what you should do to sort of help with this. It's more just considerations, and I think that you can then apply those considerations to your context. I don't think there is one answer is the right answer. I think it really depends on what works best for you and for your learners. I was at, a couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference called No Lost Generation, which was in Oman, and it was around how technology could be used to solve some of the problems that are being faced by displaced people, specifically or particularly ones displaced in Syria. And there was a panel on 21st century skills, and so critical thinking came up a little bit. And I asked the question, how can we develop critical thinking skills in this sort of digital age, and what are some of the things to consider? And actually, the panels, who are all experts in 21st century skills in the region and have done lots of work on this, we're all kind of a bit like, oh, that's a hard question. And so I'm just going to show you, this is who the people were on the panel in case anyone's interested. All super interesting people doing really interesting or important work. And this is some of their answers. This is what they said. So kind of acknowledging in the first instance that these are really helpful skills, but then kind of woolly, I guess, in terms of exactly how it's developed. You know, it's something that people can experience. You can't teach it. It needs to be made relevant to learners. And also, like, lastly, the fact that it's kind of quite hard to measure. And I think this is, the things that they said all map to the different sort of considerations that I'm going to go through. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of pull out the different bits from here and how they map to the different considerations that we're going to go through now. And I've put these considerations on continua, because I don't think it's a specific one or the other, but actually that you could probably sit at different points on this line, depending on your own views or your learners or your context. So the first one is around the difference between direct and indirect strategy for improving critical thinking. A way of describing this, I guess, is a direct approach is where you explicitly and specifically teach critical thinking as a subject in its own right, versus indirect, where the critical thinking skills are developed through focus on another topic area. And this, I think, comes to the point from the panel, which was the idea that it needs to be integrated. It can't just be something that stands alone. It needs to actually be integrated into it, which I guess maybe sort of puts you somewhere on that line. There was a study which was done around the improvement in critical thinking skills that happens when learners are at university. And it found, so there were two groups. There were learners who just improved their critical thinking skills incidentally as a result of the work that they were doing at university and the kind of processes that were required of them in terms of essay writing and so on. And then the other group did that as well, but then they also had explicit instruction in critical thinking skills as they were going through university. So they had both those things. And it found that the students who didn't even focus on it explicitly, but just did it as part of their other subjects, improved by around 20 percentile points in terms of their ability to sort of think critically or performance in exercises that were testing that. So that was just over 3 years, a 20% improvement with no explicit focus. But students who received purposeful instruction gained an additional 9% per year. So showing that the students who weren't focused on it explicitly did improve as it was integrated into their other subject areas, but that this explicit focus did actually make a difference. So this isn't suggesting that the direct approach in and of itself is better, but that maybe some sort of mix of those two might be a helpful way of dealing with or improving critical thinking. The study also said that when there was a direct approach to it and when there was an explicit focus on it, that the instruction needed to be these things. So it needed to be motivated, guided, scaffolded, graded, evaluated afterwards. So I guess the kind of takeaway from this is, okay, if you're going to do it in a direct way, you probably needs to quite some careful consideration and some thought about how you actually implement those strategies. And also that it's not particularly an easy thing to do, especially if it's something that we only now are ourselves kind of getting a better understanding of in terms of what these competencies are. It's a big ask for us to then just go and create a critical thinking course for our learners as well. So some factors to consider, so I'll just give you a second to look at them. Because if you are doing a direct focus, it's good to think about what that might be taking time away from. Okay, ideally you would be able to focus on critical thinking in some explicit way, but if that takes away from the other bits of the curriculum that they need in order to pass their tests, so you're actually doing them a favor, and I know the theme of this conference is about going beyond grades, so I'd say that maybe it is worth making that trade-off, but it's something that you need to consider. also about the other opinions and the actions of the stakeholders in your organization. Because it may be that you want to do something in a certain way, but is that possible within the constraints of your organization? Are there other people that are doing things differently? Could you combine with them in some way to kind of, yeah, bring about a positive impact for everyone? Okay, so that's number one. So the second one is kind of related. So if you do decide that in some way it's integrated, if in some way it's direct, do you make that direct training generic? Do you focus on critical thinking skills for all contexts and explicitly focus on that? Or do you say, let's break it down and let's focus on the critical thinking skills that are needed in the different contexts that we're working in? So again, another sort of, probably not a place that you'd be exactly at one end or the other, but something to consider. And this relates to the point that came out of the panel. Critical thinking needs to be made relevant to learners and to their contexts. So what context are they going to need to be thinking critically in, and how can we get that direct instruction into those specific contexts? So just an idea of some example context, just to sort of show how maybe the sorts of thinking we need are different in the different places. So I guess the critical thinking you're going to need for a game of chess is different to digesting media, which is again different to planning a holiday or being a parent. Now, there's probably quite a lot of overlap, I'd say, and this is an argument for the generic way of doing it, where you can then say, okay, this is some generic critical thinking skills, now let's apply them to these contexts. But maybe there's enough of a difference as well that justifies you saying, right, let's think about critical thinking skills specifically around this subject, or specifically around Twitter, or specifically around Facebook or news. Back to the critical thinking competency standards, their thought on it was that there's too much that you could really realistically expect one teacher to be able to help improve, which I think points towards the idea that it probably could be context specific, in that you're asking, this is maybe something that teachers of lots of different subject domains work together to try to improve. So you don't need to take responsibility on as an individual for that. You can work as a whole faculty or as a whole staff and say, let's try to integrate this into the different subject areas and we'll tackle different bits, between us. Again, I'm not saying that's an easy task, and it requires that would require a lot of coordination and a lot of people in the organization to be on board with the idea, but maybe that would be a helpful way of approaching it. This is around the internalization of concepts. This comes from criticalthinking.org again, which is the same organization, and about how we need to get critical thinking skills to be so familiar to us, so internalized that we then are able to apply them in different contexts. So some factors to consider. Do we have time to do generic training, or do we have to actually incorporate it? And either way, what's the drawback to that? And a really important thing with context-specific development is how are learners able to transfer between those domains? And actually that's important too with generic, how they're able to transfer into different subject domains. So this idea of transfer is a key consideration with this. And maybe also thinking about which contexts are specifically important to your learners. And maybe you could just start by saying, right, what's the most impactful thing at the moment? And it might be, digestion of a particular media site. So you could just say Twitter, or you could say, a news website that your learners use. And you could just focus around a few competencies on that. And that might be a really helpful way of starting, rather than getting bogged down in all of the different competencies and organizing it with different faculty members. You could just start by saying, right, what's the most important thing right now? Let's do something small to focus on that. Okay, so continuum number 3 is around how we use technology in actually helping to improve this critical thinking skills in our learners. And I guess it's sort of like technology as a teacher on one side versus technology as a time saver on the other. And I've written a short kind of description of these two different camps. So I'll just give you a second to read that. Oh, this is what it kind of related to from the panel. Technology could be used to free up time for critical thinking. So this is the sort of viewpoint of technology as time saver. So this is saying critical thinking needs us to be together to develop it. We need to have interpersonal relationships. We need to work on this collaboratively. It requires a sort of understanding of the situation that technology can't really facilitate. We need to be doing this together. But technology can help us by transferring out of the classroom all the things that don't require us to be together. And this is, again, what Alan was saying earlier on about the maths equations. Why spend ages doing that in class? You could get them to do that at home and then come together and spend some more time potentially thinking more critically around that information or how it could be used. So yeah, technology as a way of freeing up more classroom time for critical thinking is kind of one side of the camp. The other side is the technology as a tool idea. I'll give you a second to read this. And this is saying that, back to that previous slide, instruction needed to be scaffolded, it needed to be well thought through, motivated, graded, evaluated. That's realistically too much for an individual teacher to do with a class of students, and to then be able to personalize that. It's too much responsibility for a teacher. So let's use technology to help play that role. So that's the kind of other side of the continuum there. Again, I guess it would probably be that somewhere in the middle is about right for people. So let's think about technology as a tool. Is it possible to learn critical thinking online? Is it something that people do? Well, it is some thing that courses are created for. So this is a course from FutureLearn. It's called Logical and Critical Thinking. I think it's about a 12-week purely online course that you can do. For those of you who don't know FutureLearn, it's a kind of social MOOC website, so there's lots of content and videos and stuff, but then there's quite a large social element, so you communicate with people in like a chat forum and answer questions together and so on. So it's, there is a social element to it. So that's, I think, mostly focused on adults. But there are things online or computer-based things that are aimed at kids as well. So this is Smart Tutor. You can see here that the kids are just looking at a computer. There's no interaction between them. All of the tasks that they do are purely online. So they're co-located here, but they could be at home as well. So regardless of whether you believe that this is possible, it's definitely something which other organizations are doing. Probably worth noting as well that these organizations are trying in some way to promote something or sell something themselves. So worth thinking critically a little bit about what agenda there might be behind these too. The Foundation for Critical Thinking have their own courses online, but I thought it was interesting to note actually that a foundation that obviously focuses on this so much don't have so much in the way of self-study critical thinking improvement, but they have things around helping teachers to train to be able to facilitate better critical thinking in their learners. So they don't do online courses as such, but they do online teacher training courses to then help develop those skills in learners. So again, I think something for you, a couple of factors to consider. So what could your learners do at home? What would be best to do in the classroom? And then what are the sort of impacts of each of those decisions? Okay, and then the final continuum is around assessment. To the point that was made in the panel of it being hard to measure. Is everyone familiar with the difference between a formative and summative assessment approach? So assessing formatively is sort of throughout the course of the study, and summatively is at the end. So what would be the best approach here? So there are quite a lot of organisations that say that they actually are able to assess critical thinking through a program or through a test. Again, worth mentioning that these organisations are generally trying to sell that test. So I'm not sure if it's something which really is able to be, or I wonder how effective these sorts of tests are at actually figuring out how good people are at critical thinking. And especially as we're in a conference today around moving beyond grades, it seems a bit weird to sort of think about specifically how we can assess these things. And I think one kind of important question as well would be, do we actually need to spend time thinking about assessing these skills? Or at first, could we just start by working on developing them? And that's the important first step. And it's kind of too much of a challenge to measure, or if we are going to measure it, where do we sit on this climb? So what are the advantages and disadvantages of assessing in the first place? How do we define the goals that we're measuring towards? Do you want to write your own competencies, or are you happy to use the competencies that have already been written, for example, the ones I shared with you earlier? And then how will we even know if these goals are met? How do we actually write questions and tests around assessing that? I think that really with any sort of course of study or anything that you create for your learners, it would be good to have some mechanism for you evaluating the efficacy or the effect of what you've done, but kind of interesting to consider how you do that. So, whilst I wasn't able to give... Yes? Yes? I'm talking about assessing critical thinking. Yes. Yeah, I'm talking about assessing critical thinking. How do you write assessment around the competencies, the critical thinking competencies that you're trying to develop? So now I'd like you to think about, on these 4 different clients that we mentioned today, where do you think would be right for you and for your learners? What's the approach that you're currently taking if you're improving critical thinking skills? And if not, where do you think works best for you and for your context? So I'll give you just a couple of minutes to discuss these with your neighbour. Okay, so any thoughts on where or any of these continua and where you might sit yourselves? Sorry? All over the board. Can you explain your thinking at all?
We were talking math and I do business, that I wish I could get to the point where technology is a time saver. But it depends on the point I'm trying to get across. And sometimes I still think of it as a tool more than anything else. I wish I could get to the point where it's a time saver.
What, whether you could put things for them to do at home and then you could focus on the critical thinking in class?
That content that I assume that the information they get is accurate.
Right. Because the worry is that if they do it at home, they don't do it properly or something, and then you need to... Right. Yeah.
But again, I wish that we could get to that point.
Yeah. Any other points? Yeah.
I think in terms of technology, it's a time saver. Promote this idea of flipped classroom. So you can give them tasks to go away and do at home and come to class with questions they want to bring to the class, and then you can use that as a basis for the class rather than the traditional other way around of doing things.
Do something in the class and then go home and do the practice activities. Yeah, I think actually flipped classroom would work really nicely for some critical thinking activities, giving some things to read or to process at home, maybe articles from 2 different points of view or 2 different sources, and then thinking about them or highlighting something and then coming into the class and having that discussion or having a debate or getting a role play going, asking people to sort of, a hypothetical situation maybe. Yeah, I think that a flipped classroom approach would work nicely. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, we're going to try and make it a little bit more practical now by actually getting you guys to develop or to plan a critical thinking task or activity. If you wanted to make it flipped classroom, you'd be very welcome to. So first thing I want you to do is choose a competency that you would like to focus on. So, well, first of all, choose your group. So maybe get into groups of 2 or 3. Maybe it's the same people you've been working with all day. And now between you, choose one competency that you would like to focus on for the task that you're going to create. Feel free to take a photograph of this if you like, but I'll just give you couple of seconds to choose one. Okay, this group, which one have you chosen? The first one, okay. This group, which one have you chosen? Which competency have you chosen? Not yet. Yeah, choose. Divide complex questions into sub-questions. Okay, anybody not chosen one yet? You see them, right? Yeah. Okay, everybody chosen? Chosen one? Which one did you guys choose? Okay, you need to choose one. Can you see here? You guys got one? Which one? Great, identifying the assumptions. Okay, great. So, hopefully all of you have chosen one now. So the task is to look at the competency that you've chosen, and it's really important that you define your user group and your context. Because obviously the way that you would approach that competency might be completely different if it's a group of 10-year-old students versus like an adult group of students in an evening course. So define your user group, define your context. Then design a 20-minute task to develop the competency. It may be that some of that task is done at home, that's fine. You could do a flipped classroom approach where they then come back and do the task. But you need to plan a step-by-step 20-minute task that will happen in the classroom. There may have been other stuff, as I said before that. Think about what tools you'll use. Will you use a visualization? Will you have like hypothetical situations, a fact-checking exercise, a role-play exercise, goal setting? What are the different actual tools that you're going to use within your 20-minute task? Think about the technology that you're going to use, or what role technology will play. And think about how, if at all, you will evaluate the success of this task. The last thing to say, and this is quite important, is I would like you to write a brief plan, because at the end we're going to share it with another group and read through their plans. So you need to write the competency that you're developing at the top, and then write the plan and the steps of the plan quite clearly so that another group would be able to read it. So, I'm going to give you 10 minutes for this task. Do you want to take a picture of this? Yeah. If you need to take a picture of this, please do, because I'm going to change it over. Great, I'm going to give you 10 minutes to do this, and then we'll swap the tasks with another group. Okay, guys. I'm going to put my hands up. Yes. Excellent. We've only got about 6 more minutes. So hopefully, how many of you have finished your plan? Ah, nice. Okay. So could you swap your plan with the table behind you or in front of you in a minute? And just sort of, you could talk through your plans with them and think about how they've done it. Have they done anything differently? What have they done similarly? I'll give you one or 2 minutes to discuss with the other group. Yeah. If you only take away this as a classroom management technique. Okay. So I heard, some interesting discussions, maybe some sort of uncertainty or some challenge around the evaluation thing. How are you going to evaluate the success? How do you do assessment of this? It is a really hard thing. And I think the more we do it, the better we're going to get at being able to sort of make these decisions as we go, rather than having to sort of think really carefully about them. I'm going to leave you with this as a quote. Kind of saying that this is not an easy thing to do. It needs to be well thought through. You need to probably work with other people. It needs to have a real amount of commitment that goes into developing these skills. But that if we ignore them and we just don't teach them at all, then we're running a real risk of not really giving our learners what they need in terms of future development and future skills and jobs market and so on. So a challenging task, and I think that, you know, hopefully from today you've got a bit of a better understanding of what that task is and how you might go about improving those skills for your learners. So that's everything from me, so thank you very much and have a lovely rest of your day.